Hey guys, this is a presentation on how the transatlantic slave trade worked. So if you haven't watched the main lesson for this assignment, watch that first. That sets everything up. And then this presentation right now is for use for your worksheet. Okay. So if you've already watched the original lesson, then just keep watching this video. And I recommend that you pause as you go and answer the questions. Okay. Now, it's been said that money is the root of all evil. I don't know if that's necessarily true for everything, but I can say that for the transatlantic slave trade, greed, the desire for wealth was the driving factor that set everything in motion. And I'm going to explain in this lesson how that worked. Okay. So you had three groups involved. You had North America, which includes the United States, okay, the country we live in. You had Europe over here, and then you had Africa right here, right? And the Atlantic Ocean is what's in between all of them, okay? And so all of them got involved with the slave trade in order to get something that they wanted, okay? Let's start with, so the United States and North America generally, but mostly we're talking about the United States over here, had a lot of raw materials, okay? They grew a lot of cotton in the South. They had a lot of trees, so they could produce a lot of wood. And that is something that countries in Europe found very useful because Europe had very good manufacturing. That means they had lots of factories, but they didn't have always a lot of raw materials to use to make that stuff, right? So they're over here, let's say they produce a lot of things, but just as an example, they produce shirts, they produce guns. Well, for the shirts, they needed more cotton to make those shirts, right? For the guns, they needed more wood as well as other raw materials to put them together, okay? So the first step in this is just sort of understanding that trade relationship that started. And so I'm going to draw an arrow here. Because remember, it's kind of hard to draw well, so I apologize with this. Remember, it's triangular trade, so you'll see a triangle by the end of this. But the first step is, I'm just going to put RM. The United States would ship raw materials to Europe, okay? But then it got a little bit more involved because in a lot of African countries, a lot of it started on the West Coast, but it eventually moved even into Central Africa as well. They were looking to get more manufactured goods. And so since Europe just had lots of factories and were producing a lot, they figured they would trade with Europe, okay? So Europe would ship manufactured goods over to Africa, okay? I'm going to put the MF along that arrow there and ship that to Africa, okay? But there was another step involved here, which is then Europe is getting something, Africa is getting something. The United States hasn't gotten anything in this trade situation yet. And so since the U.S. had lots of farms and, like I said, we're like chopping down trees and stuff like that, they needed a labor force. They needed a lot of workers. Now, here's where things get very problematic because, of course, they could have just maybe chose to produce a little bit less, right? And just gotten a little less wealth out of the whole situation. Or they could have just chosen to pay more workers to work. But instead, they realized that, well, what if we could have slaves and make them work for free? Then we could produce so much stuff and build this massive economy around this cotton and these other things that we're producing. So what they ended up doing is the last step was, and oftentimes the Europeans would actually take them over, is that the Europeans, after bringing to Africa various goods and giving them to sort of African kings of different tribes, the Europeans would then take Africans back to America to become slaves to work that land, okay? And so usually it was a relationship where these African kings would go and maybe kidnap individuals from a different tribe, or sometimes they had prisoners in their own society and they would give them away, and then the Europeans would take them over to America, okay? And so this is where it like goes beyond just being an economic issue, an issue of just trading, goods and services, and there becomes this moral, part of the issue that everybody involved just kind of chose to ignore, right? Because at this point, we're not just literally trading inanimate objects, we're trading human beings now, and you're enslaving individuals. But again, the greed of the situation overcame the different people involved, and that is what the United States ended up getting in this trade situation, right? So you can see the sort of triangle. If I can remember, my math teacher is going to be upset. If I can remember which type of triangle this is, isosceles. I can't remember the names, but is the triangles connecting those three, so that, again, just to summarize, the United States is providing raw materials to Europe. Europe is using those raw materials, making manufactured goods. Then Europe, a bunch of different countries in Europe, are then taking manufactured goods to Africa to give to various tribes. The kings are accepting those goods, and then in exchange, they are capturing Africans and putting them in chains and putting them on boats, European boats, and then the Europeans would then take those Africans back to North America, largely the United States, but some other areas in North America as well, and selling these individuals to mostly American farmers who would use them as slaves. Okay, and that's how the trade relationship worked. And eventually, at a certain point, the slave trade got abolished, which basically made illegal. So slaves weren't traded anymore. You weren't adding new slaves. But for many years still after that point, the United States still had slaves in America. They just couldn't go and try to capture new slaves and do anything like that. But slavery, as you're probably familiar with, persisted for over 150 years in the United States. So the last thing I wanted to touch on here is, I think the last question you want to think about, again, how all this happened, is we already talked about the economic situation of how it worked. Again, just one more point on the moral situation is, I think when you study slavery, a question that comes to most people's mind is, how did people do this? How did they justify this to themselves? Because usually when people do things and it feels kind of wrong, they either stop doing it or they come up with a way to rationalize it. And that means they try to make themselves think, oh, well, it's not really that bad, right? It's kind of scary sometimes how humans are able to rationalize bad behaviors and convince themselves it's not bad. And the people involved did that same thing. Let's just take the United States, for example. The United States was a predominantly Christian nation at this time, right? And so the Bible preached that all human beings are equal, right? And so for a lot of them, they had to stop and think, wait, how can we do this if all humans are equal? Why are we enslaving these people? And so what they decided to come up with is, they decided to claim that, well, Africans are inferior to, white people. Anybody with dark skin is inferior to anybody with white skin, and they actually need to be enslaved, and they're sort of a lesser being. And they made up this inaccurate, basically fake science around it to try to prove it. And again, I want to make it 100% clear that all of that has been disproven. Is not, there's no difference in the natural ability of your sort of intelligence and all these various qualities between somebody who has dark skin or white skin. There's nothing there. But they made up this science to claim that and to try to prove that, so that they could justify to themselves that we're not doing something wrong. We're giving them what they need. Some literally said that some Americans and other people involved said that they needed to be slaves, and that's how they justified it to themselves for years. Now, of course, not everybody in America was okay with slavery, and there were people who spoke out against it. But it took a long time for enough people to really change their mind about this and to speak out against it for things to begin to change, which is, well, we'll get to the Civil War later, but that's when things started to move in a different direction meaningfully. So I guess that's the last thing I want to end with, is that this particular context of slavery is unique to all other slavery that we've seen in human history, because slavery has existed throughout history in all kinds of different places. But in the past, in other areas, slavery has been something more where, like, if you owed somebody money, you might become their slave until you paid the debt off. Prisoners were sometimes made slaves. These weren't good things by any means, but they were still systems where people could get out of it, and their children weren't necessarily always put into it. A whole race of people weren't automatically considered slaves. But this particular situation with the transatlantic slave trade, and especially what we saw persist in America for so long, had a racial component. Whereas the first time we saw, to my knowledge, where we saw this entire theory created around one race being enslaved, and again, we've seen in our country just how just horrible that is, and how much it has screwed our country up for so many years. Because of the relationships that cause problems with, and so on and so forth. So anyway, hopefully from this presentation you have a sense of understanding of how the triangular trade process worked, what each group got from another group, and you also got a sense for how the different people involved justified these actions to themselves and convinced themselves that it was not actually wrong what they were doing, when of course really we would all agree it was definitely wrong what they were doing. Okay, so go ahead, if you haven't completed the worksheet at this point, go ahead and get the rest of that finished, and as always, send me a message if you have any questions. Have a good one.